Great. Hello, I'd like to welcome everyone to Partitions of Gender, Historicizing Cross-Gender Casting in 21st Century Theater Education. My name is Cameron Crookston. I will be your facilitator for today. I'm joined today by Hutton, Shelley Liebembuk, Fiona Ritchie, and Grahame Renyk, and we will be having a roundtable discussion with you. So the way this works is we have all created some kind of document based on our research or our teaching and shared it with each other prior to this. We've all had a chance to review each other's work, and we'll now be having a live, or recorded rather, conversation in which we engage with each other. So we're not going to be presenting our own material as such, but I will give all the participants a chance just to give you a brief overview of what they submitted so that you at home have some context for what we're talking about. I'll give you a little background on the concept for the roundtable. So my research is in drag and drag performance. I teach both theater history and sexual diversity history, history of sexuality. And about 2 years ago, I was invited to give a guest lecture at a colleague's class on theater and popular culture. And I gave a talk, historicizing drag as a popular form, and really kind of looking at the popular moment of drag's mainstream popularity, and then historicizing that. And talking about how drag is distinct from other forms of gender performance, what makes it kind of a unique style of popular theater culture, and then also connecting it to queer culture, both socially and politically, and kind of tracking that over the last 200-ish years. And after the discussion, a student came up to me. She was very enthusiastic. It was really lovely. And she talked about the fact that she is an acting student, and she is often cast in male roles, and very often that is more out of necessity. She feels that it's, there aren't enough roles for female acting training situations, and she hadn't thought previously a lot about the implications of that work, and she was really excited that this conversation gave her a framework to consider that. And I was so excited by her, by what she had said to me, and I wanted to talk about it some more. So I put out a call for CATR and really wanted to talk to other teachers and scholars about how they have encountered the concept of cross-gender or non-traditional gender or gender bending in their research, in their teaching, in their actor training, in production, as directors, as teachers, as scholars. And I got some really amazing stuff. So we're gonna chat about the pedagogy of cross-gender casting. That is me. I think we will just go down. I have a list. You can't see it, but I can. So I'll just kind of go around. Shelley, do you want to just introduce yourself and give us a little? Yeah.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here and to meet many of you. I am Shelley Liebembuk, and I want to acknowledge that I am calling into our virtual gathering from the unceded territory of the Stolo Nation here in BC. And I have the fortune to work and live here at the moment. I am an associate professor. I'm an assistant professor, you see. It's early here. I'm an assistant professor in the theater department at the University of the Fraser Valley here. And what I submitted to the group just briefly was the work I did last year in the spring of 2019, directing a production of Bertolt Brecht's St. Joan of the Stockyards at Mount Allison University, New Brunswick. So part of that project for me, what was really exciting was to take up production as well as the aesthetic of Verfremdung and kind of making them familiar, and actually use it as a way to talk about the politics of representation with the students and engage them, both the cast and the crew, because that's a big interest of mine, and I had a lot of freedom over there when I was directing. And so the way we were doing that was really thinking through Verfremdung and how the process of acting the not but, which is this idea that in everything that the body is representing, there's also that kind of complicating of that space between the actor and the character to also hold the space for what are the choices not being made or articulated. And importantly, not just around individual agency, but also around kind of social necessity and what are the possibilities, kind of the social gestus, which I think is significant. So we were using that specifically to look at class aspects, because that's what the piece is really about. And for Brecht, as you probably know, that's a big element, but also to look at gender. So specifically, kind of part of my submission briefly was also kind of looking back at the history of where Brecht first was inspired to articulate his idea of Verfremdung. And it was very interesting. I had known about it, but actually this roundtable was an opportunity to take a little time and research it a little further. That Brecht had seen a demonstration in Moscow in 1935 by the very famous Chinese Dan performer, which is female impersonator of Jingju or Beijing opera, called Mei Langfang. And when he saw Mei perform, Brecht was really awestruck by the fact that the distinction between actor and character was really underscored. Significantly, he watched a demonstration where Mei was not using what he would have usually been using, which is costume and specific lighting for the female impersonation. And moreover, it's quite a Western misreading of the hyper-stylized form of Beijing opera, that Brecht assumed that it was all formalist and invested in a distinction, where actually Beijing opera is not invested in that, and Mei's own writing is actually on how to master the art of female impersonation, is about actually creating a parallel but dialectical relationship between actor and character, which again, many of us who, we teach acting or we've studied acting, it's always far more complex than just distinction, right? So interesting, so for Mei as well. But for Brecht, really, he was really interested in kind of that, and he wrote in 1936 his first articulation of Verfremdungseffekt in the essay Alienation Effect in Chinese Acting, which became kind of the base for a lot of his thinking on what we now call the A effect or the V effect, depending. So what I was interested in was, again, seeing how Verfremdung could be used to also problematize gender and think around gender politic, even though Brecht himself was quite blind to it. But many feminist theorists have taken that up and said, okay, well, it can be used very well to do this, even though Brecht had no interest in doing it. So in our production at Mount Allison, kind of just very briefly, what I started to do, which I've done in the past and believe is a great way to go about it, when you're not in an industry setting, like what Melia, you were talking about, to actually do gender neutral casting to try to be more meritocratic. And so what that resulted in is I actually had the three main Meat King characters that are very hyper-masculine mobster, American 1920s Chicago mobsters, played by female-identified performers. However, once we started the project, what was really revelatory for me was the students were really excited that the casting call had a gender neutral element to it. And they kept pushing to see, well, what does that mean for our characters now? And what does that mean for where we're going to take this? And so actually what transpired was where I had kind of come in thinking this cross-gendering is a great opportunity to do some drag king performance work, which we still did with one of the actors. It also resulted that the actor that was playing Mahler, the principal role, was actually really invested in non-binary gender representation. So it was all about actually working through what that would look like and how, again, not to keep reducing that, because the text itself is quite binary in its articulation of gender, as well as we, again, our own assumptions around how to perform it and how to make it visible without reducing it. So that was kind of our process, and a really revelatory one for me to realize and to try to think through working with these, the politics of gender and representation in a way that's more nuanced and can move past a lot of heteronormative binary assumptions that we might otherwise have. Thank you.
Fiona, would you like to go next?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, great to see everybody. Thank you for all of your amazing work, and Cameron for hosting this conversation. So my name's Fiona Ritchie. I'm an associate professor in the Department of English at McGill University in Montreal on the unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka. I'm a theatre historian, broadly speaking, and my interests are in the representation or the presentation of Shakespeare in the Restoration and 18th century, and particularly how gender intersects with that. So in terms of women performing Shakespeare, but also women critics and women audience members. So my paper kind of started from, we're all as theatre scholars aware of the kind of gender bending of Shakespeare's plays and performance, in that the female parts are played by a boy actor, and many scholars have written brilliantly about this. So my question was really, what happens when women start playing women's parts? Does this gender ambiguity completely disappear at that point? In fact, I discovered that the popular practice of adaptation of Shakespeare, which was so common in the Restoration and 18th century, meant that Shakespeare continued, that Shakespeare continued but to employ this gender ambiguity, but it shifted. The practice of cross-dressing now shifts largely to women instead of men. So you have very few men cross-dressing as female characters, but you have a lot of women cross-dressing as men. My paper examined one particular adaptation, which was Dryden and Davenant's The Tempest or the Enchanted Island from the 1660s. It was popular from the 1660s right through until about 1838, so it had incredible longevity. And this adaptation adds some characters. It adds Dorinda as a sister for Miranda, and also adds Hippolito, who is Dorinda's suitor. So Hippolito is a male role, but the text makes clear that the part is played by a female actor. So I was interested in what that brought to the play. There's also the role of Sycorax, who in this version is Caliban's sister rather than his mother, which is sort of expanded in this text, and that was played by a male actor. So we have a kind of sense of the comic grotesque there with the male actor playing the female, but also as Sycorax is presented as an indigenous inhabitant of the island that the characters are on, we have an opportunity to examine the intersection of cross-gender and cross-race casting, because of course this part was played by a white actor. So these adaptations aren't performed today, but we can trace their influence in contemporary Shakespeare performance practices that seek to open up opportunities, especially for women, by casting them in male roles, for example, or by rewriting male parts as female. And I'll just also add a note that in addition to this research work, I teach sometimes a graduate seminar on 18th century cross-dressing. And it looks at how the practice is used in drama, but also we look at some real life examples of 18th century cross-dressers, so real historical figures. And students have found that quite interesting in sort of opening up the idea that our ideas of gender as a spectrum rather than a binary actually pre-exist in the 20th and 21st centuries. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Fiona. Millie, would you like to go next?
I'll just unmute myself. Yeah, hi. I'm Millie Hutton, and I'm a professor of acting at Sheridan College on the Mississaugas of the New Credit Nations, unceded land. I come to the table having adapted Hedda Gabler for the fourth year graduating class 2017, in which I changed the role of Liebembuk to a woman, set it in 1963 at the exact point of Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique and that opening up of female power. More on that later, why I chose 1963, but yeah, I spent what began as an idea, sort of, oh, maybe Liebembuk could be a woman, then turned into 5 months of adapting much more work than I thought. But I ultimately felt within the world of realism that it didn't work for me to just use somebody else's text and call Liebembuk a woman and have all the male pronouns in there. And so I did the work to adapt it, and that was a lot, but I'm glad I did it. So in many ways, really, Hedda is just the small culmination of concerns that I've had for a while, working at a different university in the overall training of LGBTQ plus actors. I grew up myself as a LGBTQ actor within the systems in England and later in North America, and I really think that there's a big missing there that I'm also part of missing. A lot of damage done to LGBTQ actors in forcing them into a heteronormative narrative. For many, many, many years, your badge of honor was to prove how straight you could be within those programs. And the same was not true of heterosexual counterparts in class. They were never asked to, do their Romeo and be, or do their normal hard. You know, gay actors were constantly, queer actors constantly asked to prove their heteronormative worth, with no pedagogy at all behind that. Just throw them the scene and good luck with that. So that's been bothering me for a long time. And now that's become even more prevalent with the training of non-binary, gender variant and trans actors. And as a teacher who really, one of the big responsibilities I have in my acting program is to teach realism. And I'm in great concern and looking for change in how realism is approached for non-heteronormative actors. So.
That's fabulous, thanks. And last, Graham, if you'd like to.
Sure, I am Grahame Renyk. I am an adjunct faculty lecturer in the Dan School of Drama and Music at Queen's University, which is on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee peoples. But I'm coming to you quarantined here in Toronto, or the land of Tekaronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat. So I am grateful to be able to quarantine here safely in these lands. So it's interesting actually that Millie mentioned this question of heteronormativity and actor training. My stumbling into this conversation, I think it's best described as that kind of comes from a moment in an acting class about 7 years ago where a student, a male identifying cis male student, when asked which sort of monologue from Angels in America, which was the text we were using, he jokingly said Ethel Rosenberg's monologue because he's a giant Meryl Streep fan and she played him in the film version. And everyone laughed because he's that famously a Meryl Streep fan in our department. And thankfully, in some sort of gift of inspiration that we sometimes get as teachers, where the wisdom bonks us on the head, before I responded jokingly and kind, I actually had a second and thought, well, why not do the speech? Why not do that monologue? And the exercise was a realism-based exercise, but also it was an exercise based on asking the performers to connect personally to the text and to the character. So we retained those learning outcomes with the Ethel Rosenberg monologue, sort of not asking for the character's gender to change, but also not necessarily asking for the actor's gender to change. And of all the characters in Angels in America, it really was the character that most immediately suited sort of the energies of this actor. It fit him like a glove. And so that got me beginning to ask some of the questions that Millie was asking there too, about sort of the damages, the potential damages of the heteronormativity of our, and also of the sort of binariness of practices, casting breakdowns that list the number of male and female performers. So that inspired me to direct a production of Lilies, Michel-Marc Bouchard's Lilies, for our department, because I'd also realized that in the decade previous, there had been virtually no queer characters in any of our department productions, with the exception of one who was actually played by one of our professors, a straight male professor. And so I was looking at a lot of these male identifying students that I had who were awkwardly playing police officers and soldiers, and because they couldn't get the lead roles, these masculine lead roles. So they were playing these sort of masculine choral roles to great awkwardness and ill-fitting moments. Lilies is, Michel-Marc Bouchard, when he wrote it, discussed that he posited the question to himself of, is emotion gendered? Are emotions gendered? So he wrote a play that I think would best be described as having a very sort of feminine emotional canvas. It's highly sentimental. It plays on capital R romanticism and a star-crossed lovers central storyline between two young boys that ends in tragedy, but of the sort of capital R romantic tragedy. There are many tears and much vulnerability and weakness and beauty and all of those sort of ideas wrapped up. But Bouchard mandates that all of the roles be played by what would be male actor bodies or male identified actor bodies, to sort of see what that effect has. And what was really interesting was exploring the effect that it had on the actors. So the actors who were playing female characters, we tried very hard to make sure these were not sort of drag approach or camp approach, and nor were we thinking about them as female impersonation. The costumes were custom built and tailored to the bodies of those three actors. There was no padding, there were no wigs. It was their natural hair styled as they wished. And they were involved in the fittings throughout the process, which was super interesting to watch how they came to own these garments and their beauty within these garments is their own. And we also encouraged the use of the play as a way of sort of discovering and finding not the sort of gender performative identities, but more internal feminine and masculine energies that comprise each of these performers, whether they were playing male characters or female characters. What was the mix of these that these characters, these performances brought out for you? And sort of inviting a rethinking, I guess, of the layers of gender, for there being both a sort of a performative gender identities, but also what are the internal mixes and confluences of what they perceive to be masculinities and femininities that are emerging, that sometimes are emerging prosthetically through the play, and also maybe aren't able to emerge in day-to-day life and existence. So it was a very interesting experience that I'm still kind of processing.
Thanks so much, Graham. I will now go. My name is, again, Cameron Crookston, and I right now am teaching and working at the Marcus Bonham Center for Sexual Diversity Studies at the University of Toronto, which is located on the unceded land of the Huron-Wendat, Mississaugas of the New Credit River, and many other named and unnamed Indigenous peoples. The document I shared with the group was very similar to what I had shared with the guest lecture, which was, I'm very often asked as a theater historian who studies drag and as a sexual diversity studies historian about the origins of drag or the history of drag. And I kind of bristle at the question, even though I do try and work with it. And part of it is the word origin, especially in queer discourses, is often something we kind of try and deconstruct, because there's often origins are about purity, the idea that something is most essential at the moment of birth. So I try and problematize the degree to which that's possible when we're talking about art forms. But also theater history makes that a very complicated question, because the long history of cross-dressing and gendered casting in theater, it can be kind of tempting to say, and I always say this very tongue-in-cheek, is that like Clytemnestra and Antigone are the original drag queens because the history of cross-dressing is as long as the history of theater. But I don't really love that as an answer. So I try and focus often on drag less specifically about its gendered aspects and also its other dramaturgical qualities. So if we kind of look at contemporary drag in the late 20th and early 21st century and think about everything that was into drag beyond gender, which often sounds like a paradox, but we can see elements like cultural parody, comedy, music and dance that come from a very specific form of burlesque, often influences of ball culture and also pageant culture. That it's usually unscripted, that it has strong connotations to LGBT cultural practices, and that it very often happens in what we might call non-traditional performance spaces, social spaces, political spaces. And so if we take all of those things into account, I often land on the early 19th century as, if not an origin, a really important point for a turning point in the development of what today we understand as drag. And part of that is just my own work in trying to distinguish drag as a specific cultural practice that is distinct from other forms of gendered cross-dressing. So I talked about the 19th century, and another reason I think that the 19th century is a really important point in the history of drag is the 19th century is also where we get the contemporary understanding of queer identity. There has been same-sex love and different forms of gender presentation, for millennia, but in terms of the contemporary understanding of sexuality as an identity category and the forming of queer subcultures as we understand them, it's actually fairly recent development, and it happens predominantly across the 19th century. So if we think of drag as emerging or turning a corner in the 19th century, I think it's very important to understand that it happens to coincide with the birth of these specific forms of popular performance culture, and also with the birth of contemporary queer identity. And then I talk also about the way that we can actually trace the development, both artistically and politically, of drag as an art form across the 20th century in tandem with LGBT rights. Drag is forced underground as an art form throughout the 20th century as queer bodies and queer identities become more actively policed, as homophobia and transphobia become bigger concepts in the cultural consciousness and something people are more aware of and are more hostile towards in their day-to-day life. Drag becomes less and less legitimized. And drag performers across the 20th century start to have to negotiate the politics of respectability with their art form. And we start to see multiple points of resurgence of drag as a popular art form in the 1980s, and then across the 1990s, and then most recently in the last 10 to 15 years. I mean, RuPaul's Drag Race is kind of hard to ignore when you talk about the history of drag. But these points in which drag pops up as popular moments in pop culture tend to coincide with specific moments in LGBT rights activism. There's also a thread that I find troubling but interesting too, in the way that gay rights and trans rights intersect or don't intersect, and the way that drag has been understood as exclusively cisgender or having connotations of transgender identity does tend to have a very short cultural memory and tends to be rewritten a lot. For about the last 20 to 30 years, there has been a popular distancing of legitimate drag from trans identity, which really doesn't really start forming until the 1970s, and even then it's quite uneven and comes from a very transphobic push amongst predominantly cis gay men who are trying to distance themselves from identities they feel are less respectable. We're starting to see a pushback in the last 5 years in which a lot of trans artists and trans drag performers are trying to excavate how important the history of trans artists have been in developing drag over the last 200 years. And I think it's very important to talk about this in a theater context because very often transphobic arguments, very conservative discourses that attack queer identity will often use the logic that queer identities are kind of a new invention and that they're artificial somehow, and that returning to a binary and returning to heteronormativity is a returning to kind of the way things have always been. And I think theater does such a fabulous job of exposing, Fiona, you talked about this briefly, exposing that there's actually a very rich history of both sexual and gender diversity in the world. And although that has not been very well recorded because theater has such a rich history of gender performance and is offering kind of a legal safe haven to people who are non-normative in their gender presentation, by studying the history of cross-dressing in performance, we do actually get a really rich history of gender identity in the world and how complicated and robust different forms of gender identity have been across history. That's what I shared with the group. So I'd like to thank everyone for so beautifully summing up their work and for all the work you shared with us. I'm now gonna pivot to ask some questions. Again, I have some prepared questions, but I absolutely welcome everyone to follow up question or just ask your own. I'll start with one that I've been really interested to hear about, and I've already seen come up in some of your work. So as a teacher in sexual diversity studies, I have noticed really in the last 5 years in particular, students are becoming so aware of issues of gender identity because trans rights and also drag as a popular cultural form is so in the news, is so in the media, and it's coming so much to the forefront. So I find my students are much more informed about that. And I'm wondering how or if that awareness translates into the classroom. Do students bring that into your rehearsal spaces or into your research? How does that impact it?
Definitely in mine. I would say in the last maybe 5, but certainly 3 years, it's like gone like this. The amount of well, what do I want to say here? I want to be careful. The amount of knowledge and need for expression that non-binary and LGBTQ actors are bringing into the room. I would say the same with race, that identity politics is much more vibrant in the acting studio for me. Anyway, I think that's a good thing. One of my struggles is, and I'm going to speak specifically from realism. It's not that I think realism is the way in. It just happens to be reflected incredibly in the industry right now. And one of the things I need to do is make sure that my students are employable. So trying to cover all bases. I do find that the texts that are available are really uneven. Like to get scenes that are that exist, plenty of them in male-female dynamics, less so in female-female, regardless of the relationship. Not bad for queer men, and incredibly sparse for lesbian women, gay women. And when I say that, I mean scenes that have equity of epicness to them. There are scenes for gay women, but there's not a lot of, unless I'm missing something, and please send me your stuff. And text is so binary, even contemporary text. Not all of it, of course, but still really binary. And so yeah, there's a lot of discussion and a lot of catch up for the industry to do.
Yeah, I'd have to agree that it is sort of a challenge. It's a challenge to sort of hope that the texts will provide the roles. But what's become really, I think, exciting in this increase in students' ability to converse at a very high level and comprehend at a very high level before arriving in the door, which wasn't the case when we worked on Lilies in 2014, 2015, which is really recent. But the understanding since then had transformed, is that the casting process in an acting studio and in a production, I think like Shelley kind of described, can become a negotiation between the instructor and the student, and the negotiation around the character's gender identities, or the ways in which a performer may want to approach that, but also the types of roles a performer wants to play. I still have my folder on my computer that says men scenes, women scenes, men monologue, women monologues, but I now no longer just put the men's monologues in a pile on that side of the room and send the men over there and the women over there. We just put them all out. And it's just an invite to read the whole set of monologues provided and look for connection points, and then we'll start negotiating and weaving how we're going to work these. So we were working at the Shaw Festival on a course that I teach, an intensive I teach there for Queens, and one student was playing Vivi Warren, So it's one of Shaw's sort of manly women, or however you might describe a modern, like, right? And this is a non-binary performer. And it was a great, interesting negotiation of how they wanted to play. And they navigated through that whole Shaw course where at times they wanted to play a woman with all of the Victorian manners required. And at other points, play Vivi Warren as a woman of her time, but in breeches, in pants, in masculine attire, but self-conscious of it in the context of the time. And the research and the negotiation was not only sort of in terms of the practice really exciting, but also in terms of the academic conversation about context and period was thrilling for the whole class to try and figure out how we as performers in 2020 try and navigate Shaw's world in 1890. That it became a problem that now, because of their ability to converse, opened up such exciting conversation. I don't know, Shelley, do you have, I was really intrigued at your early casting process you were talking about and how you approached that. I kind of was hoping to hear a bit more.
Yeah, thank you, Graham, and thank you, Millie, and everybody. I think, again, when I was reading everybody's submissions, it was so exciting. I was telling Cameron before, I totally geeked out. I was like, oh my God. And as Millie, you said, I think all of us coming at it from, you know, a different entry point, but I think thinking through the same. I would say, yeah, kind of on that, indeed, like it was such a mix for me of, again, coming in with the gender neutral, which was just, you know, I was just like, okay, this is just a thing. Again, I'm conservatory trained actor background at Atlantic Theater Company in New York, where it was like you had to play your, you know, cisgender, like there was no question. And indeed, as Millie, you said, and thank you for also just like highlighting that. I think the invisibility in an industry that actually has so many socially queer identified people, the invisibility in the acting classroom and in like, well, now we're going to perform heteronormativity over and over again because that's what the industry wants, unless we're kind of titillating them with something else. I think that was definitely something there. So I think, again, what I personally love about still working in theater and I guess working in kind of the breadth of a liberal arts BA is often that I don't have that industry standard and I can just say, okay, we're just here. It's about, again, as I said, like politics of representation, really thinking that toward also your social identifications and complexity, but also just theatrically really exploring and exploding that. And in this production, it was interesting because indeed I had kind of course, some assumptions I assumed having worked before, as we know, like often there are a lot of, you know, female identified performers in these acting classes in BA programs, more so than male identified. So I assumed I'd have a lot of female identified people coming out to the audition. So I'd already thought, okay, these would be cool to cross gender and so on. And then really it was a delight when they were like, well, didn't you say it was gender neutral though? So what did you mean by that? Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, you know, that's just a term that just meant that I'm not doing like male to female. And suddenly I was like, yeah, okay, thank you. Take me to task. Let's actually, what does that actually mean? And again, like I'd done my dissertation on Carmelita Tropicana, who's a queer Latinx performer. So I'd done a lot of work kind of reading around and getting more familiarized with kind of drag kinging. So that was a real kind of interest for me to try out. But again, what was really great, I have to say again, with this actor who wanted to play Mahler, that they were really like, okay, but because I was like, oh, you know, we could even have, you know, there's kind of a queer relationship that we could have. And she was like, yeah, okay, but this all feels really reductive, right? To kind of just create this like hint that like, ooh, but couldn't that be a queer lover? And again, I think it really tested me in a wonderful way of being like, right, what are these kind of, again, very oversimplified assumptions around that? And significantly, interestingly, we also had a lot of folk in the cast who actually were queer, identified as queer, and who were cast in roles that, again, it kind of by making it a contemporary version of the Brecht, it kind of, that aspect wasn't present or absent, if that makes sense. So I think it was an opening, like Graham, I loved in your writing on Lilies, kind of thinking around the energies and what that means. And I think again, as a teacher of acting, what it means when you say can you highlight this aspect in your performance? And realizing like, what would be the violence if I was like, no, but they have to be, like, what are the assumptions around because the character is supposed to be male or female? What does that really mean? And what does the scene require dynamically between the two performers really? You know, and I think that was kind of that test. And again, just a lot of it, without noticing things I had internalized just in my own acting school of, right, as much as we keep saying, you know, there's so many tactics you can use, and yet there's all this assumptiveness around, well, if you're identifying in this gender category, the tactics are going to look like this when you use them. So again, just, I don't know if that really, it just was, it was a total opening up. And again, now I have to kind of renegotiate that because I'm at a small university within the British Columbia Bible Belt. So what does that mean for the kind of work that the students come in or want to share or don't, as well as questions around, this may be kind of a side question, but for me, one of the questions is sometimes about how to maintain students who might identify as queer, but don't seem to be comfortable sharing that in the room, how to safeguard that, and how to not to, again, kind of almost to be like, Graham, like, this is the work for everybody, choose whatever speaks to you, but then how do we also protect in spaces that are, unfortunately, like the larger, not in my root classroom, I always say not in this classroom, however, we have to be aware of like just outside the door, what is the homophobia or the kind of the other things that these students might have to be negotiating.
You know, I would be so interested to hear both in how this speaks to the research you're doing, but also you mentioned that you teach a class on like 18th century cross-dressing for grad students, so go for it.
Yeah, so I've also noticed this same shift that everyone else is talking about that's been really powerful in the last sort of 3 years or so. And that's one of the things that motivated me to start teaching this course, was because I could see that students had an appetite for it and were interested in it. And because when I started digging, I found all this material that I had no idea was there, this very long history. I'll say that in terms of popular culture, I think the touch point in that class is less the contemporary drag performance, although that does come up, but it's more stuff to do with like masculine cross-dressing women. So things like the TV show Gentleman Jack always comes up as, you know, almost exactly based in this period, but they're really kind of fascinated with that. And one thing I've noticed is that, so the early scholarship on figures like Anne Lister and other earlier female cross-dressers that I cover was feminist scholarship that wanted to recover them as lesbians. And my students really challenge that. They're really pushing back on that and saying, well, that is not necessarily the most interesting or the primary motive for this person's cross-dressing. So they're much more interested in coming at it from a place of scholarship about the fluidity of gender identity and reading those characters and people in those terms. I'll also say that I've been challenged a lot by students who often have a much bigger and more nuanced vocabulary for talking about some of this stuff than I do, and that's been really refreshing and has led to some really great conversations. So yeah, it's been really interesting. And I also, Shelley, take your point really seriously about how to not put certain individuals on the spot in a particular classroom. It's always something that I'm very conscious of. So I think, that's obviously a really important thing to consider.
Because we're talking about this historical moment in conversation with kind of our own pedagogy, I'm interested to, so one thing I loved, I think I asked for this, but I didn't think I would get such a beautiful example of it, is you're all talking about essentially period pieces or pieces from distinct points in history that are different from our own, like around even the 1990s in terms of gender politics, or that's a million years ago now. So I'm wondering how the politics and the historicizing that moment of where all these pieces or research are from, how that impacts the conversation, if it does.
Well, just bouncing off of sort of that question, what Fiona was talking about a bit about there too, is as we were presenting this production of Lilies, which is, you know, two young boys, star-crossed lovers, and certainly 1985 is its time of writing, but it's set in, it's a bunch of prisoners in 1956, re-performing an event from 1912 in Quebec. But we realized pretty quickly as a group that our audience base, because it's a department show, is going to be the student population of the university. And so the thing that really appealed to me when I first read the play as a teenager, which was the star-crossed sort of sexuality of it, is no longer necessarily what's going to draw the current audience. And so it necessitated a repositioning of the play to fit their current interests and issues, which were far less to do with taboo sexualities and sort of gay rights. So it actually kind of ceased to be a gay play and moved very much into a play about masculinity and masculinities and femininity. And we very consciously rebuilt the play to be geared towards the female gaze. That was what we set as our goal. So we made sure that the leading men were sort of Byronically handsome and towards a sort of a romantic female gaze. And then we sort of tweaked everything in and around it to try as much as possible to lean into this idea of this is a feminine space. And whatever that meant. We weren't quite sure what that meant, so we were interrogating that conversation. And it did end up being a show where the audience was sobbing and heaving in tears, but we also pushed very heavy on the affect. We tried to hit it as far as we could. But what was really compelling was that the conversations that came out of it were actually about masculinity and emotion. And the sometimes disconnect between those and the damages and the harms that causes. So that it was as much about the male characters and their emotional journey, canvases and journeys, as it was about the female characters. And then the conversations about gender and emotion and public emotion and feeling and affect were really, really advanced and complex. That's much more where they were headed, and their language continues to be really sophisticated about it. We still use the play in one of my first year courses, and it's exciting to watch how those conversations continue to move. But it's really interesting that the shift has moved away from that sort of focus on sexuality from the 80s and the 90s, much more towards conversations about masculinities in particular in 2020.
Yeah, I mean, that resonates with me so much when I've taught texts like The Normal Heart or even Angels in America, which are so recent, trying to communicate to students how important sex and desire were in the 70s and 80s in that moment as being one of the very subtle, I think, shifts that we've seen in the last 30 years that resonates so much for me. So, yeah, I really appreciate that.
I asked a couple of my students before coming on this. I had almost a 2-hour conversation with 4 of my students, two cisgendered heterosexual women who did Hedda, then with a non-binary gender variant actor, and then with a trans actor who are currently all in training. And you know, at one point I was like, should we just throw realism out the window? Like, what do we do? Should I just throw it away and start again? And one of the actors said, just to reflect on how articulate and how ahead our students are, just, you know, mind-blowing. Like, there's more than one point of transition. You don't have, the narrative doesn't have to necessarily match up, as long as the actor is, you know, able to look at the work and say, well, I'm a trans actor and I experienced this character somewhere along the transition, and that's an entry point for me. And again, that not every actor is the same, right? And to just constantly keep the communication open as to what kind of scenes any given actor wants to work on. Because I may look at a role and go, that's not trans role. But the actor may go, actually, I see lots of potential entry. This seems to me like an entry point where this actor is at this, where this character is at this point. And I think that my students are, you know, ahead of me. And I feel I feel worried about that, to be honest. Like, it's not that I don't hold the space, but I want to make sure that that they're teaching me where this needs to be going, because even as an LGBTQ teacher, I'm not ahead of them.
I would just jump in on that, kind of tying back to Cameron, how you framed that question around kind of using the historical specificity. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe broadening it out really to what you're talking about, at least for me, that comes around a lot in like access to text. Whenever I'm teaching text-based courses, acting courses, it's such a different process than even within those courses, my unit that's non-text-based is, I feel such a lightness of not having to negotiate that process. But again, I totally recognize the need, again, to prepare them, to prepare them for text work and with text work. And I think what was helpful, again, was with the Brecht production at Mount Allison, was actually, it was the semester prior, I did a dramaturgy course. And so what I kind of actually used, I used the same piece as our kind of base. And so we really kind of got to do all that dramaturgical work on the text and see what they could find. And I think, you know, at the best of moments, whatever we're working on in class, even just like in an acting class, when they hardly have time to read the full text, let alone, you know, again, depending on the choices, some semesters I have everyone working on the same text. Other semesters I think, no, there needs to be more text, but then we're just like basically scratching the surface. But trying to figure out how to gift them that ability to have that critical position, that dissonance with the text. What is this text? And often indeed, like the further away it is, the more we kind of do that or are allowed to do that, but also saying, you know, all of these texts, no matter how famous the playwright or canonical or how many times it's been produced, what do you see and what do you want to kind of try on and resist as we're working through it? And I think, again, you know, sometimes I'm always surprised at, honestly, this last year here, one of the biggest surprises has been people actually not wanting to work on anything that has to do with desire, whatever related.
Yeah.
Physically uncomfortable, much more than I remember in that age group. Mm-hmm. And maybe again, because I went to conservatory, not in a BA, I don't know, but a huge hesitation toward any physicality, mm-hmm. even honestly, anything that's slightly bigger than very muted. So that was a surprise, because when I ask again, like, what are you comfortable? What are you not comfortable? And again, as you say, holding that space and kind of being very surprised at what that comes out. And as well as other negotiations of, so yeah, I don't know. I hope that we can do that. And I really wish, again, that, you know, there was more access to more text, and tying back kind of really to what you said also about realist text versus, like, again, there's some, like, again, from the studies I had done, like the Wow Cafe in New York in the 90s, like the amazing texts of some of these, but again, they would be considered within like Canadian Academy. Can I teach a text that is that sexually vulgar? Like, it's not even about in what, you know, again, yes, probably also because it's homosexual content, but I feel like sometimes the restrictions are like, I feel tasked to find texts that don't have a lot of swearing or, which is already like, I don't, you know, again, I went to.
Well, there is that balance, right? Sorry to interrupt, but that balance, as you said, that bringing in texts such as those, then some students are like, I don't want to do that. I think it's really exciting. I also teach a class that has no text in it at all, and it's so liberating to just be human beings as we meet. And sometimes, you know, I'm at this stage now where I'm like, okay, I gotta provide way more text, way more choices. And then I'm concerned, I'm like, okay, students, here's 50 billion scripts for you to read and choose where you feel comfortable. And it's like downloading a huge amount of work on my students to, you know, in the past, I'd choose 6 plays for realism and we divide them up. People tell me what they're interested in and then I cast. But now I'm like, no, it can't be 6 plays. Can't be that limited. And so making sure that there's enough for people to choose from, and yet they have to wade through an awful lot of material just to get to their choice, is while they're already doing a million other classes. So that's just a comment.
can just say something about the Shakespeare aspect to this too. I mean, I get as annoyed as anyone about the fixation on Shakespeare all the time, but it happens to be what my paper is about. So I'm sorry if I'm going to be a bit bardolatrous. But one of the things that I've tried to do with my students in teaching some of these adaptations is just to show them that Shakespeare is not sacrosanct. Like, we can mess with the text. And I'm always incredibly surprised by how entrenched this attitude that we can't mess with Shakespeare is, even with young people who are otherwise like very radical in many ways. So when they learn that, you know, The Tempest and many other plays were performed in a completely different way for 150 years, often without Shakespeare's name even attached to them, I think that offers up a lot of possibilities. And I've done, you know, other courses on Shakespeare adaptation that have involved some performance work where students have done some really interesting stuff with gender in terms of like reimagining the characters. And so sometimes I think looking at these kind of adaptations, these historical adaptations that reimagine the gender of characters, encourages students to think about performances of the original plays, for want of a better term, that where they might do something similar and what the possibilities are for something like that.
It's an interesting balance right now with having these students who will be the artists of the future, but then also having to facilitate their transition into the theater of the moment, which I think is clearly in a lot of the mindset, like particularly with Shakespeare, as you say, Fiona, right? Like of the not wanting to change or modify, and how that can even be inculcated in the students themselves, that Shakespeare is somehow sacrosanct, which is historically false, evidently from the paper that you wrote, right? See, is really only the last 100 to 130 years. Thank you, I guess, David Garrick, if I remember. I mean, I'm dusting off some old theater history for leaving us with that legacy of Shakespeare has to be exactly as is. So what I think is really interesting about what everybody's been talking about is that these conversations, these negotiations that we're all having with the students, and thinking of them as negotiations where the students can teach us, but we can also teach them, because no one really has the toolkit or the language yet. The toolkit that is being currently used in the professional theater clearly needs to radically change. I don't know if you were following some of the conversations through Stratford, but the tyranny of the as cast contract and what that does in terms of both race and gender for actors who are hired. You know, your contract might be to play Miranda in The Tempest and then as cast in 2 other productions. You've signed the contract, you are now obligated to show up, and then you walk into the rehearsal hall and the director just says, okay, you gay cis male Grahame Renyk are going to play a Chinese man in a musical theater production of Anything Goes, which happened to me in my first professional gig when I was 18 years old. Because you need later in Anything Goes 2 Chinese people, like really 1920s horrific stereotype version of that, 1920s Hollywood horrific stereotype version, for the lead characters to really offensively impersonate. So I wasn't even the lead impersonating it, I was the chorus kid who had to play it in the opening scene because there were no people of color in the cast. And I was 19 years old, still in school, in another country working a contract. My housing was dependent upon the theater. My summer was dependent upon the theater. So what can you do there? There's no negotiation in those castings. There's no thinking through those castings, and the toolkits are clearly non-existent amongst many of the people who hold the reins of power. So we are the front line as instructors, I think, for the ability to start facilitating that change. And perhaps maybe even the most responsible in a lot of ways.
I think that's really important what you're saying, that, it's not an either or, right? Like if it doesn't happen in the colleges and the universities, it is not going to happen in the industry. Like it has to happen there. And yet my classroom is not just the playground for me to go, oh, I want to discover these things. Then my students are like, great, I find myself not able to be cast in the industry. you know, so it's some kind of balance between providing a pathway for a livelihood and being a significant part of the change. And I'm leaning less toward the industry more and more.
Well, maybe there's a degree to which we should think of all casting as cross-gender casting, like with the same thinking mindset, right? That it's that the performer and the role, we just eliminate all assumptions that they align, and that there are the negotiations that come along through that. So, you know, Hamlet is Hamlet. So what does Hamlet is the easiest example, because it's always, the question is, what do you bring to it? What's your Hamlet? But maybe that's the question for all, even for Marcellus or Francisco and Bernardo, or, right? Like, what's your Francisco?
So I have a question I would really like to ask those of you who are actively involved in casting people and directing productions. So thinking about this link with performance of race that you've brought up, Graham, and that's come up before, I think and hope the term colorblind casting is on the way out now, right? And that we're moving more towards a color conscious casting model, where people are really thinking about, what does it mean to cast a Black actor in this role? Or what does it mean to have this character be Asian, and so on. So I'm wondering if there's a parallel here with gender, and if thinking about gender conscious casting could be useful to us in some way. So thinking, as you're suggesting, Graham, with every role, like what does this character's gender presentation, what does this actor's gender presentation mean for them playing this role? I don't know, is that a useful term or not?
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, it's sort of going to what Millie was saying, that one of your students said to you this morning of, you know, where along in this sort of transition and this experience of even like a liminality of a gender identity within a highly binary culture. That's an asset that actor brings to the ability to interpret a role, particularly in this moment. Right? Queerness is an asset, not a problem to be solved in casting. It's, I mean, whiteness is the global minority, right? It's not, it may be sort of the majority in a white supremacist institution, and sort of and the maleness of the institution also is sort of in the majority. But to meet the moment right now, the insights that are not the same as my insights as a director, as a teacher, as a cast member, are assets, are required. Like the conversations that we need to have collaboratively in the room about embodying characters and about style. I think it's also interesting what you bring up about realism, is even overt conversations about, is this the right style for what we're trying to do here narratively, but also politically?
One of my students, one of my non-binary students said, this is great, what does realism really mean? I mean, is it following society's norms of something, or is it actually real life? And I've tried very hard in the last years not to have people playing each other's mothers or, you know, parents, or, you know, try to keep people within the early 30s for 20-year-old people. And because that's all rubbish anyway, right? You put people in the seagull and one's playing somebody's mother, like there's nothing realistic about that in theater school, but it's passed for generations that people would do those scenes and not challenge them. Oh, you're my mother. Well, it's odd because you're actually younger than me, but let's go along with it anyway and call it realism. So I think that it's just, the only way forward is to just let the students lead and provide the material, and have the students say, like you said, Graham, about energy, you know, this is the energy I feel, and I want to do this scene. Easier in monologues because people are autonomous, right? But then you've got to find somebody who also wants to do the energy of the other person in that scene. So, you know, it's not easy, but I think it's the way forward.
So, question then, like, I know that the students are still coming in with the sort of the North American and Canadian students that I teach certainly come in with biases towards and assumptions towards psychological realism and coherent characterization. So I'm really interested, Shelley, because you took them right into the heart of the effect, which is, and trying to pull those apart, which is also a very drag thing too, right? The ability to hold, I love the phrase you used, you quoted, like to subvert the identificatory collapse between the actor and the character. So I'm curious about the conversations that led to for you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's, you know, I think like this past year, I'm just teaching like intro acting, advanced acting, whatever. And I've realized that for myself, especially because indeed the majority of students come in with that assumption around psychological realism, the first unit, the first thing I do is I'm like, okay, we're doing this like larger than life, you know, the fact that like there's an actor over here and there's a character over here, and let's really highlight that and take that up. And I think what that does is it just opens up in scale, and again, just helping them find their body, right, as well, and find the fact that like the terms of what I'm trying to do, one of the biggest learning objectives is to re-embody kind of the space and be expressive. And again, I think it does what it allowed, for example, in the St. Joan production, using that Verfremdungseffect, I think just really allowed a means to make clear also that you weren't cast because you fit the role. You were cast because I can see that you can take on the challenges of constructing this character. And, you know, again, even in my regular acting classes, I've come to always leading with, as I'm handing out, you know, the scene work or the monologues, to say, you know, again, I'm giving you this as a challenge, and based not on any assumptions of who you are at all, based on things where I think, okay, if I see some trepidation, maybe I'll give you someone who's more bold. Or if I see some of the, you know, again, kind of pushing against, actually, not necessarily because I want them not to reach where they're going, but because I find, especially as a start, it's important for me, and maybe because of, you know, kind of my trying to push them toward a larger theatrical sense of expression, to take away assumptions of kind of performing self, which I think, again, you know, especially interestingly, now that I'm teaching an acting class on Zoom this summer, or like this, so it's all video, right? So assumptions around like how they mediate their own performance on camera, which they have a lot of other experience doing that toward a very different thing. Like, oh, I know what angle my face looks really good at when I take this photo and so on. And actually being like, no, I want you to be kind of a different kind of character than yourself, and to kind of separate that identification, which I find, yeah, both helpful theatrically. And just the last thing I will say is, for myself, I also find it a more healthy emotional space that I can negotiate. Because again, just kind of tying back to like my own acting conservatory experience, it was very difficult at the pushed collapse of identity and character, and to continually do that and see my colleagues and I working to do that without a lot of psychological support in that process. You know, it is a very challenging thing, and I think it is one of the wonders of acting. It's not to say, I think there has to be, as I mentioned, like May Lanfang writing so eloquently around the parallel but dialectical relationship of actor and character. And I think, you know, all the great performers are navigating that, and navigating the very real psychological and emotional challenges of identifying and performing character at the same time. But again, for myself, and the space in which I teach, which is not conservatory also, but also means that like I'm a studio teacher, but the other teachers are kind of academics teaching things. We're not like a studio team either. I think it helps to make that separation, to also hopefully hold some more space for them emotionally, to not navigate that as much, or not. But again, inevitably, I think there's a lot that comes out, as we know, when we're working on productions and we're working on character, and it's not, yeah, it's complicated. But to me, it ties back, Fiona, I also wanted to ask you, because it totally struck out to me when I read your paper around this idea that the character, all you shall see of her is perfect man, and kind of the only way you will find out that she's a woman is if you bed her after, or whatever it was. I'm so fascinated by kind of almost, again, this kind of audience titillation of like, you might be thinking that we know it's a female actress in a male role, and yet there's all this pushing against that ability to navigate that ambiguity almost.
Yeah, I think the text works quite hard to kind of set up binaries that the audience is expected to buy into. So one of my questions about the play is, to what degree can the actor performing that role kind of play with those binaries and subvert that a little bit? And so one of the things that I've always come up against in looking at these plays in which female actors cross-dress as men is that the automatic assumption is that that was done in order to titillate the male audience. So there's an assumption that the male audience is the dominant audience. Probably statistically, numerically, they were certainly the ones with the bigger voice and so on. And yes, there's definitely an element of that in putting a woman in breeches where she ordinarily would have been wearing a skirt that concealed everything about her figure. But I'm just curious about, you know, what possibilities were there for the actress to kind of subvert that sexualization. A lot of the time that comes out as indulging in very typically masculine behavior. So it sort of involves her going to the other part of the binary. But I think sometimes there's some kind of collapsing in the middle, as I talk about with the actress playing Hippolyto, who is behaving like a man, but doing that in order to woo a woman who she's romantically attracted to. So the character is male, but the actor is female. So there's a very homoerotic display going on the stage, potentially. And I think restoration texts like this too are really slippery, because they have the lines that you were quoting are from the prologue and epilogue, which are a sort of way of constructing for the audience how the playwright or how the theatre manager wants the audience to see the play. So there's always a question of like, to what degree did audiences actually receive it that way? And that's something it's very, very hard to recover, because we have so few eyewitness accounts. If we have them, they're all by men. It's always Samuel Pepys who gets quoted, who, you know, offers some great useful stuff about the theatre, but is also mostly just interested in going backstage to sexually assault the actresses. So I don't really know, you know, how much store we can put in his perception of gender on the stage. But yeah, there's a lot of like historiographical complications to sort of accessing how these plays were received at the time. So, and maybe another question is to think about, could we perform them now? And if so, would that give us anything? How would they be received now? I honestly don't know the answers to that, but I'd be curious to try it.
I mean, that's so interesting. And I was thinking that specifically with your piece, Fiona, just because of where the 1600s are in terms of the history of sexual identity. I was thinking a lot about, Roberta Barker has a piece about restaging Shakespeare as performed in the mid-20th century, and this conundrum of like, even if you could somehow, and maybe you can, perfectly recreate the performance on stage, you can't recreate that audience, and it's always going to be a 20th century or 21st century audience projecting their understandings of gender and sexuality and the connotations around gender performance with sex. That is such a 20th century concept. I mean, that's another reason I was so interested in how all of your work touches on different periods, because we're all researching and teaching and directing in the 21st century, and it's such a negotiation, and we seem to be in kind of a moment of transition in the audience we're performing for and the students we're working with. How they receive this work is in a moment of flux. I wanted to touch really quickly, I'm mindful of the time, but Fiona and Shelley, you both brought up the concept of intersectionality around race and gender in your work, and I'd be really curious just to know how that gets taught. How you bring that into the room, whether the classroom or the paper or the rehearsal room?
Yeah, with the context of this play, I honestly haven't really got much further than this is horrifying. So I don't know, this is not a great model, but I'm still trying to figure it out. So this racialized character that's being performed by a female character that's being performed by a male actor who is white, and it's a very broadly comic performance. We know this from looking at the other repertory that actor engaged in. So we know that is how it's designed to be received. So I think at the very least, it makes for an interesting comparison with maybe the agency that women actors now have on the stage, contrasted with the complete erasure and absence of actors of color. Obviously, they just aren't there at all. And even characters of color are obviously treated in very problematic ways and kind of being erased from the narrative in multiple ways.
Yeah, I think in my case, again, it was in this production, definitely with the kind of drag king, we were looking at also the assumption around that it's a white male. So then this, the work that Halberstam has written around how like to drag white maleness is to kind of that invisible masculinity, whereas the masculinity of non-white males is assumed to be abundantly visible. So again, kind of looking at that, and interestingly, I think in being open to the project, and again the fact that the characters, in a way, in a Brecht play are complex, but also caricatures, and kind of again maybe tying back to Graham your question around like how to do that for the performers. I had one performer who was Indigenous and read as such, and so kind of it became for the we did a lot of like we would devise or work on kind of a scene and I had the other actors speak to that and say what they saw and kind of build that. The production kind of followed an acting class model in certain ways where we could. And a lot of the times they were like, oh, we see you take all these bold choices. And again, I think that difficulty around are all of those like choices, or some of that the fact that like a primarily white audience is reading that onto that body and assuming that body is making those choices. So, and I think opening it up to, I just tried to keep making note of that and opening it up and saying, let's be aware of these assumptions and look at these aspects of the politics of representation, whoever the body on stage is, right? So again, to point toward the things that we make invisible all the time in those performances. Same with femininity, same, again, cross-gender, again, intersectionally, as we're looking through those, not to mention questions around class, which is very difficult there in like a relatively, again, not consistently, but overall appearing affluent liberal arts setting. How do we talk about class in a way that's not reductive and actually perform class, and especially perform class when it's intersectionally situated? So again, all of these things were, I think, the beginnings of a question. I think definitely far from a real conversation. And I think, again, that sometimes my question with these texts is to try to problematize the text, but maybe also realize that, in another way, if you take a text that's written by someone who's already doing that work across all of these aspects, there's so much richness that we can steward the students to. And for myself, maybe realizing if I can to try to use works that are more rich, like Graham, you're talking about Bouchard and Lilies, right? Like it's such a wonderfully complex text already there. And I think that's such a gift, as opposed to, kind of trying to create gender, thinking around gender in a Brechtian text, which denies gender in certain ways so much that, again, it was a conversation, but again, I don't know how much that even arrived at the audience or not. And questions around casting, same. Yeah, I know, like Fiona, your suggestion to move toward conscious casting. And I think, yeah, that question around negotiation is a real big one, without also just, tokenizing. Like I know when I was in New York, I'm ethnic. What does that mean? Okay, for the industry, I'm ethnic. So trying not to do those things in a theatrical educational context, but realizing again that there are industry things, or like, which accent am I going to do in speech class? Well, I better get these accents down because those are the ones that I'm going to be cast doing, and so on. So again, it's big questions, which sometimes I feel like I get to sidestep because I'm working in a broad BA program, but I think that we should work to support our students as best we can, and indeed give them that recognition that they can also make their own work, though, or make space within the industry.
And allowing them to understand, to become empowered within that system. I think, like, if I know I'm going to get a lot of work if my ethnic accent is good, then I want to do that because that money will provide me with the ability to do this work that I really want, right? So that our students aren't feeling like they can't grasp onto tools within the establishment that can further their lives and their careers and get on the inside and keep changing it from the inside, right? Rather than feel like everything in the industry is against them and that they're never going to get anywhere within it. That's incredibly demoralizing, I think. I knew in 1986 as I graduated that I better be straight or I was not. I better read straight or I was never going to work. And I was absolutely right in that. I would never work or like rarely work, and it would be in something I devised myself. Now, in 2020, it really is heartbreaking that people would still be having that same conversation. But,
there's some sort of promising signs of evolution. The name escapes me right now, but the woman who spent her entire career on TV playing female and concealing her history as a trans actor. It's in the Disclosure, the documentary that's available to watch now. And then has finally felt empowered almost at the nearing the end of her career to sort of share her truth with the world. That's hopeful. I mean, there's a lot of work to do. What you said, Shelley, about the text, actually that's how we stumbled. Like I said at the start, I stumbled into all these conversations. I think it was a consequence in large part of that text, Bouchard's text, and kind of in two ways. One, the central question he had set out for himself in terms of gender forced conversations about masculinities. And because the cast was from different backgrounds and family lineages from different parts of the world, it also forced discussions of cultural masculinities. And it kind of pluralized that term permanently for us, that it isn't masculinity, there are masculinities in the room, and femininities, and genders, and cultures, and like they're all, the plurality of it was forced into the center of the room as soon as we actually started conversing with each other and the text. If I were to impose directorial vision or things, all of that would have failed. But maybe it's because of the liberal arts institutional structure, we were able to take the time to present the play as a collective problem for all of us to explore and solve. And then the other thing that was really valuable was the meta-theatrical nature of the play. So that we could lean into like a deliberate identificatory collapse. Although we did a lot of care, and that's basically what my assistant director's job was to do emotional care with these performers as these things opened up. They were lovely, but we had people running out of rehearsal in tears for personal reasons every third day. And I think it was just because it was bringing up all of these emotions for them. So we had policies in place that allowed for that, we just had cry time and then proper care. But again, none of this was planned. We stumbled into all of it and just tried to be careful about it. But the meta-theatricality also helped because it then, like you talked about, also pulled apart actor and character and kept them somewhat suspended away from each other because it's a play within a play, so that we could collapse and then detach, which maybe saved us a lot more than I realized until you mentioned it about a minute and a half ago.
No, there is more freedom for sure there. The last 5 years in my program it teaches in terms of elements now. Like we talk to actors about earth, fire, water, and air with lots of explanation about what that is artistically. And it's so freeing to not be in this constant like psychological, pseudo-therapeutic world where you're getting involved in people's personalities and trying to change it through actor training. It's horrible and dangerous, and it's much much closer to what you talk about, Graham, about energies, where students now say, you know, I think I have a lot of earth, but I don't really use a lot of air in my body or in my imagination or in my, and so they're like, can I have a character that's a lot of air, which I much prefer than, can I have a woman who's, you know, sexy? Or can you find me a woman who's not supposed to be sexy? So it's getting better, but it's yeah, it's long overdue.
So I'm mindful of the time. We've reached our end, and I would love to keep going for another hour at least. But thank you all so much. I mean, one thing, just to wrap up, I've heard so much that's really great, and I think particularly different touchstones about being in conversation with our students and letting our students really help us move forward, and acknowledging that our students have a different kind of experience and vocabulary. And so I'm always really excited when pedagogical relationships kind of move past this like mastery versus like student receptor. And I hear a lot of that today, and I'm so empowered and excited by that. So yeah, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. I'd just like to thank Fiona, Shelley, Graham, and Millie for your amazing work and these great conversations you brought us with. I'm going to stop the recording, and I'll just ask my participants to stick around for a minute. We'll debrief, but I'd like to thank everyone at CATR Partitions this year for letting us participate digitally, and we hope you enjoyed the conversation.